Hey folks, how's everybody doing tonight? It's been a little while since we've got to hang out and be doing some brewing, and I'm happy to hang out with all y'all and talk some new Phyrexia All Will Be One reveals, specifically this beauty who we've got up on the screen, Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. But before we get into that, I wanted to remind everybody of my fantastic sponsors, without whom this stream would not be possible. Everyone from my affiliate, Harry Tarantula, through to Alter Sleeves, where you can get cool art for your cards, cover up maybe some shitty artists. Moxfield, who will be doing our deck building in tonight, and you can go follow my profile to see all of my decks and my brews, and our friends at Quiver as well. Fantastic. They just shipped out their pink Quiver carrying cases. If y'all got your hands on one of them, good on you. Let me know in chat. All right. But tonight, we want to be taking a look at the latest reveal from Phyrexia All Will Be One. And this I'm excited for. I've really liked the new generation of Praetors, and Elesh Norn is no exception. Hey, there's our friends out there, Arctic Muffins. How you doing, y'all? The newest white Praetor iteration here, Elesh Norn, is a bit of a callback and something new here. So for 5 mana, we're looking at a 4/7 with Vigilance. Surprise, surprise, this is the same size and keyword as the original Elesh Norn. So not a lot is changing there, except that the cost is coming down pretty considerably, which is pretty funny because this Elesh Norn does some pretty wild things. The previous Elesh Norn shrunk all of your opponent's creatures by 2 and buffed all of your creatures by 2. This Elesh Norn is basically a Panharmonicon for you and a Torpor Orb for your opponents. And we'll take a look at both of those. Panharmonicon. Thank you. So Panharmonicon, 4 mana artifact that reads: if an artifact or creature entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that triggers an additional time. However, new Norn says that if a permanent entering the battlefield would cause an ability to trigger, ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers an additional time. A little bit of a difference there. Panharmonicon only cares about artifacts or creatures entering the battlefield, not lands, for instance. And it only cares about those triggering something that you control. This is if a permanent enters the battlefield. So not only does it care about lands, but it cares about your opponent's permanents too. Very important distinction. Because previously, if you had, say, a Soul Warden out, and a creature entered the battlefield under your control, you would gain 2 life. But if a creature entered the battlefield under an opponent's control, you would still only gain 1 life. Right? Or Panharmonicon only cares about things that you control entering the battlefield. Now, however, thank you very much, Prox, for following. About time, buddy. Soul Warden, on the other hand, with new Elesh Norn out, when your opponent has a creature entering the battlefield, as opposed to only gaining 1 life with Panharmonicon, you now gain 2, because Elesh Norn sees a permanent you control triggering when a permanent enters the battlefield. Okay, so a bit of a distinction there. Doesn't just care about your permanents, cares about everybody's permanents triggering something you control. Okay? Very important distinction. Okay? The flip side of this is Torpor Orb. Torpor Orb is an artifact for 2 mana that says creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. This is a symmetrical effect and only cares about creatures. Elesh Norn, on the other hand, the new one, says permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger. Meaning, same with that first ability, if a permanent you control entering the battlefield would cause something an opponent controls to trigger, that doesn't happen. So now it's not about the permanent entering the battlefield, it's about the trigger happening. So, myself included, a lot of people have been saying Panharmonicon and Torpor Orb, but that's not quite the case. This is carrying not about the permanents entering, but the triggers happening. All right? Very important distinction. However, this symmetrical effect is incredibly important, or this asymmetrical effect is incredibly important, because we're looking at 5 mana to be getting an additional 6+ mana worth of effects on this body. So not only are we getting a 5/7 Vigilance body, but we're getting the best parts of a Panharmonicon, arguably a better Panharmonicon, and a better Torpor Orb, all staple of this body. That is just nutty amounts of value for something that you can have in the command zone. Okay? And I just want to emphasize this. This is a ridiculous amount of value. Some of the new Praetors that we've seen, and that we'll take a look at in a second as I pull up our friends at Scryfall here, but some of the new Praetors that we've seen have been good, but nowhere near this good. So the new Jin Gitaxis, for instance, says whenever you cast an artifact, instant, or sorcery spell, copy it, and whenever an opponent casts it, counter it, and it only happens once. That's real good, but look at that price tag. 7 mana on a 5/5 body. Elesh Norn gets you a bigger, better body, and doubles up on your ETBs. Okay? And this is once each turn on both of these, where the new Elesh Norn is just static. It stops or doubles your ETBs. That's a phenomenal amount of value. The new Shieldred, incredible body for 4 mana, 4/5 with Death Touch. And drawing cards to gain life, and your opponent's drawing cards to lose life. Incredible, incredible value. I would say Shieldred second amongst these new Praetors, because, again, 4 mana for this kind of effect, you can't ask for better. Urabrask Heretic Praetor, this one's poop. I hate to say it, but in comparison to Shieldred and Elesh Norn, Urabrask here just does not hold up. 5 mana for a 4/4 with haste. That's an okay body. But it gets you another impulsive draw on each of your turns. And at the beginning of each opponent's turn, it turns their draws into impulsive draws, or their first draw into an impulsive draw. That effect is not fantastic, but hey, it's okay. And Vorinclex Monstrous Raider is, I mean, a 6/6 for 6 with trample and haste. I'd say that this is the best amongst the bodies. But counter doubling season, and reducing the counters that your opponents get, that's up there too. Yeah, Arctic, that's a good point. There's just a lot of card draw as it is, especially in Commander. If you're only drawing 1 card per turn, you're going to be behind anyway. And Urabrask just hating on that first draw, it doesn't do a lot. It's not impactful. Sure, it gets you an extra draw every turn, and that's valuable in red. But if you're in mono red, you're going to be doing other stuff. So this Norn is an incredible, incredible piece. And up there with these new designed Praetors. And there's a lot that we can be doing with this. Just so much that we can be doing with this. Yeah, exactly. New Urabrask just isn't impactful against a lot of decks that are drawing a lot of cards. But New Norn absolutely does quite a bit. Like, New Norn is a fantastic hate piece against a lot of decks. Look at every landfall deck being shut off with Elesh Norn out. With Elesh Norn out, you shut off all of those ETB effects. You shut off all of the whatchamacallit, impact tremors kind of effects. Right? Anything that deals damage, Perforos, impact tremors that deal damage on ETBs, they're all shut off. And one of my favorites, Reckless Fireweaver, is shut off too. And that's when an artifact enters the battlefield under an opponent's control. I love Reckless Fireweaver as a win con, especially in my decks that include Academy Manufactor, because you just make so many artifacts. But Elesh Norn shuts that right off. Not to mention just the straight creature ETBs. Muffin's great point. Even good old Hoof is null. Right? You don't get that ETB effect to pump all of your creatures and get to give them all trample and attack. No, that's shut off with Elesh Norn out. And so are a lot of other effects, like enchantments entering the battlefield. Look at all of the white enchantments that exile something when they enter the battlefield, right? Look at the whatchamacallit, was it Circle? Any of the it's not whatchamacallit. It's been so long since I've played it. The white enchantment, 3 mana, enter something, exile something. Grasp of Fate is certainly one of them. And Grasp of Fate, this is you exiling stuff, but hey, if you cast this into an opponent's Elesh Norn, Oblivion Ring, thank you. If you cast this into an opponent's Elesh Norn, something like this, like a Grasp of Fate or an Oblivion Ring, does nothing. So Oblivion Ring is one of those classic, I think at this point a little outdated, white removal pieces that when it enters the battlefield, you exile something else. When it leaves the battlefield, you return it. But if you try and cast this into an opponent's Elesh Norn, then it enters the battlefield and it does nothing, because it is a permanent entering the battlefield causing a trigger. So that does nothing. It shuts off all of these things, which, heck, that's actually pretty good. Without any synergy pieces, just shutting off your opponent's synergy pieces is pretty all right. So there's a lot that we can do with this new Elesh Norn. There's just a ton we can do, from focusing on her as a value engine to a real cornerstone of, hey, how can we get even more out of our value? Because as much as Oblivion Ring is shut off by an opponent's Elesh Norn, it's doubled by your Elesh Norn. This is now 3 mana exile 2 permanents until it leaves the battlefield. And that is really, really good. But this Elesh Norn is what I would call an enhancer rather than enabler. An enabler commander is a commander that you build around because it makes the deck do something. This Elesh Norn is an enhancer because everything in your deck will do something, but this Elesh Norn will make it do something more or do something better. Another great example of that is Teysa Karlov. So Teysa Karlov is a black and white legend that says if a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it happens an additional time, and also tokens you control have vigilance and lifelink. But this doesn't make your deck do something it couldn't already do in causing death triggers to double. It just makes your deck do things twice as much, twice as impactful. This means that if your commander is removed, and if it dies over and over and over again, to the point where you can't cast it anymore, it's not like your deck is sunk. It's not like your deck can't do the thing anymore. It just means that it doesn't do it twice as fast or twice as impactful. So it's a really, really interesting look at how a commander can be a cornerstone of a deck or how it can be an enhancer in a deck. This kind of Elesh Norn, much like Teysa, you can do the thing in your deck. You can win without ever casting it. And that's an important distinction. All right, very interesting, very interesting. Now, with all of that being said, let's get into the build. Okay, there's a lot that we can do with Elesh Norn. And there's a lot that we can do with ETBs and doubling up on ETBs. I want our deck to do the thing without Norn, but I want it to do the thing better with Norn out. So, while I talk through some recommendations and some things that I want to do, make sure to shout out in chat what you want to see in this deck, or the things that you would really want to double up on the effects of. And the first one that I really like is Preston. So have you all seen this new Preston the Vanisher from Jumpstart 2022? I did a little short about him, but my God, does he work well with this new Elesh Norn. This is whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't cast, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a 0/1 white illusion. Then you can sacrifice 5 illusions to exile a permanent. That part's gravy. The part about creatures entering the battlefield without being cast, like if they were blinked, or if they were reanimated, is a great way to reuse or double up on ETB triggers. Because you get the original and you get the token illusion that has the same text box. Now, if we add this in with Elesh Norn's ability to double triggers, now if you're blinking a creature, it comes back in with an illusion, and now you get that trigger 4 times. 4 times! I don't need to tell you how much of a massive value bomb that can be. Yes, blame Chris. Thank you, Prox. Now, there's just so much that we can do with these two in tow. And in fact, we can build a deck around ETB triggers of our permanents, our creatures, whatever it might be, and essentially have these two as interchangeable as commanders. You might have seen my video over on my channel some months ago about commander swapping, where you can build a deck where the 99 stays the same, but the commander can change to several options, and the deck still does the thing. It still does the thing perfectly well, and is pretty much seamless. And if you want something a little bit different, or if you want to change power levels, or you want a different vector of approach to playing the deck, that's 100% what I would recommend. And in this case, Preston and Elesh Norn are basically interchangeable here. We could potentially find another mono-white commander that can go in the 99, but could easily be pulled out and the optional commander on this. And I love those kind of decks. We've got a great recommendation from Arctic for Thraben Inspector. Thraben Inspector is just a neat little 1 mana 1/2 that investigates when it enters the battlefield, making a clue token. With Elesh Norn out, that's 2 clue tokens. If you manage to Preston little Thraben Inspector, that's 4 clue tokens. And for white, that's some incredible card draw, which I like a lot. Tokens could be an interesting build. Yeah, absolutely. There is a lot of token production, and it can be doubled with something like an Anointed Procession. Keep that in mind. But the problem is that tokens themselves typically don't have ETB triggers, and you would want something in play that triggers off of those tokens entering. So if you're making a volume of tokens, however it be, you want something triggering in play. And fortunately, we have a few ways that on permanence, more things that make tokens on ETB. Yeah, absolutely. That's possible too. But there are a few ETB triggers that in white, I would be very happy to double up on, like Welcoming Vampire. Because this is card draw. Welcoming Vampire is a 3-mana 2/3 flyer. Whenever one or more other creatures with power 2 or less enters the battlefield, draw a card. It triggers only once each turn. Ooh. You note that? Note that little line right there? Triggers only once each turn? I wonder how that interacts with Elesh Norn, causing things to trigger an additional time. Well, I think the overriding of triggering only once each turn is a big detriment here, isn't it? If it triggers an additional time, but if it can only trigger once, well, you aren't going to get that extra card draw. Right? So no matter whether you've got Elesh Norn out or not, something like Welcoming Vampire doesn't work the way we want it to. Isn't that interesting? A little bit of anti-synergy. I was about to bring up Tokasha's Welcome. Because Tokasha's Welcome, what do you know? It says whenever one or more creatures with mana value 3 or less enter the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Oh, but this ability triggers only once each turn. That means if Elesh Norn is triggering it an additional time, Boo is right. That's something to look out for. That's a huge part of a potential value engine in this deck that's shut off by this triggers only once each turn rider. So if you're building out there, keep that in mind too. It can't trigger an additional time if it says it only triggers one time. All right? Very interesting. So a bit of a non-bow there. Now, if we're making tokens, for instance, or if we're having creatures enter the battlefield under our control, I think that there is an old standby in Sun Titan that is absolutely an include in something like this. Being able to pull things out of the yard and itself having an ETB is a great thing to double up on. Without Norn out, you're still getting something out of the yard. And on attack, you can continue to reuse ETB effects. With Norn out, not only does Sun Titan enter the battlefield and have his own trigger that doubles up, when you attack and you pull something out, whatever you pull out, whether it be on ETB or on attack, that now gets twice as many enters the battlefield triggers. And with Preston out, if you're pulling a creature back from the yard, Preston now creates a spirit, or an illusion rather, of a creature that you pull out that then has its own ETBs. You can get some real nutty enters the battlefield chains going on with these effects. Right? Really crazy. With some sacrifice engines, you can create potentially a 1-card loop, and it wouldn't be 1 card, with creatures that resurrect other creatures or pull back other creatures. You can have an ETB trigger on the stack, sacrifice the creature, pull itself out? Does that work? I don't think so. Talking through this. But some very interesting things that you can do with loops and pulling permanents and creatures out of the yard to get more triggers, to pull more stuff out of the yard. I think it's very interesting. And look, on worst case scenario, Sun Titan pulls back lands from your yard too. Whether it be fetch lands, or anything else. We could be looking at lands with enters the battlefield triggers that you could be reusing on top of that. Because again, Elesh Norn just cares about any permanent entering the battlefield. Felidar Retreat is exactly what I was thinking. Felidar Retreat cares about lands entering the battlefield under your control. So Felidar Retreat is a nifty little 4-mana enchantment. And on landfall, which is a permanent entering the battlefield causing a permanent to trigger, you can either create a 2/2 white cat beast or put a counter on each creature you control. They gain vigilance until end of turn. With Elesh Norn out, that second ability is 2 +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. They gain vigilance. That can turn any mob of small creatures into massive threats right away, immediately. And even if you're playing only one land a turn, even if you're just playing a plains each turn, it's a great addition to this deck. Hey, Chris, how's it going, man? Thank you for coming out. Doing excellent. Been a little while. We'll have to hang out soon. All right. So there are a ton of effects here, like some classics that we can look at, like Fiend Hunter, that fit in this deck. And we talked about Oblivion Ring, where Oblivion Ring can enter the battlefield and exile 2 permanents. Fiend Hunter's the same way, but on a body. But Fiend Hunter has that classic trick where you're able to sacrifice it with the triggers on the stack, so your opponents never get those permanents back. So if we've got some sack engines or some sack outlets with reanimation engines, because this does fall under Sun Titan capabilities, this is an excellent way to mow down permanents potentially. So we're looking at a synergy heavy, removal heavy deck, even with just a handful of cards in it so far. There's a lot that I would love to include in a deck like this. Right? And it's not just creatures. We talked about lands entering. Yeah. Felidar Guardian and Restoration Angel already go infinite. This is now twice as infinite, double infinite, 4 times infinite. And we can go Blinky on this to reuse Enter the Battlefield effects. And I think that that's a great place to be as well. So Felidar Guardian, the cat, and Resto Angel are both blink creatures, blink bodies. So you can blink another creature that has an ETB effect, give it a nice little blink, and reuse those ETB triggers. Yeah, exactly. Karmic Guide is another great one. Karmic Guide and Revel Arc are that classic combo if you've got a sack outlet too. But this is now pulling back 2 pieces each time. So Karmic Guide is a great piece because, again, not only does it have an ETB trigger, but it can pull back creatures with ETB triggers. And remember, with Preston in the deck too, if we're reanimating a creature from the graveyard, it's entering the battlefield without being cast, meaning we can get illusion copies of it too. Teleportation Circle, one of my favorite new white cards. Probably my white card of the year, Teleportation Circle, of last year. But it is our White Conjurer's Closet. Not quite White Conjurer's Closet, but does what we want it to. It's going to blink our permanents and reuse those Enter the Battlefield triggers. Incredible. Incredible in this deck. Okay, and remember, it is target artifact or creature. So if we include artifacts in here with Enters the Battlefield effects, let's say Wellsprings, right? Whether it be an Ichor Wellspring or a Mycosynth Wellspring. These are ETB effects of permanents. So here's Ichor Wellspring entering the battlefield, or is put into a graveyard, draw a card. We can blink these to draw 2 additional cards a turn. Really helpful, really handy. And Mycosynth Wellspring. Mycosynth Wellspring. Let's see. Mycosynth Wellspring is the tutor up a land to our hand. Basic land. Which, I mean, in white, yes please, we can always use more of. But these are enter the battlefield effects of permanents we control, which are incredibly helpful. Ephemerate is probably white's best blink spell, because it does have rebound, and it does cost only a single mana. So exile target creature you control, return to the battlefield, meaning it blanks targeted removal, and can reuse those enter the battlefield effects. And if we've cast it from our hand, at the beginning of our next upkeep, we get to do the exact same thing. Very handy, and in this case, 4 triggers across 2 turns for 1 mana. Beautiful. Can't ask for better than that. But this starts me doing the investigation of this. This starts me looking at what kind of other really good enter the battlefield effects do we have in white. And this is where I use Scryfall and I use their advanced tools to look at phrases like enters the battlefield and leave it at that. And we'll go a white commander color identity. And look, there are 814 potential enter the battlefield effects in white and colorless. Right? Whether it be on lands, getting us energy, or artifacts, drawing us cards. There are a bunch of little effects that we can get that have these great enter the battlefield copyable effects. Okay? And it can be things like enchantments as well. For instance, Angelic Gift is just a small little aura, but when it enters the battlefield, we draw a card. It's 2 mana to give something flying. It's not a massive effect. And if we're blinking our creatures, we might not want to include it, but it does say that beautiful phrase when it enters the battlefield, draw a card. And that is incredible. Because Elesh Norn now makes that happen twice. We draw twice as many cards. Okay? Look at the classic Angel of Glory's Rise. Right? When it enters the battlefield, you exile all zombies and return all human creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. If we wanted to go human tribal in here with sacrifice outlets, we could have this trigger twice, and in between triggers, sacrifice all of the humans that were just reanimated and bring them back a second time, doubling up on all of their enter the battlefield abilities. That'd be really neat. Right? Angel of the Ruins. Here's a really new, really important card. Because this is from the Strixhaven Commander set, but probably one of the most used new white creatures I think I've seen. It's got plane cycling, but it's also a 5/7 flyer for 7 mana, and when it enters the battlefield, exile up to 2 target artifacts or enchantments. With Elesh Norn out, you're exiling 4 artifacts or enchantments. It is insane. As a curve topper or something that you put into your yard to cheat back out with that karmic guide that we entered, incredible. Right? Absolutely fantastic. Right? I think that there's a lot that we can do here. Right? So let's see. Let's do something about that. No? Okay. All right. Yeah, it puts itself in the graveyard, which is excellent. Allows you to reanimate it. And I think that those are exactly what we want out of this. So let's... and it's Angel of the Ruins. Right? Now, we did talk about things like Grasp of Fate earlier. You shut off your opponent's Grasp of Fate, but you make your Grasp of Fate twice as good. And Grasp of Fate is a simple 3 mana. 3 mana is important for Sun Titan. Enchantment that says, for each opponent, exile up to 1 target non-land permanent that player controls until Grasp of Fate leaves the battlefield. In this case, it's 3 mana, exile 6 permanents, 2 from each player. Right? Can't get better than that. Is this a Legion Loyalty deck? Great question, Muffins. If I had a choice, every deck would be a Legion's Loyalty deck. Because that is my favorite white card of the year. Legion's Loyalty. Legion's Loyalty gives all of your creatures Myriad. Legion's Legion Loyalty. Thank you. Legion Loyalty. It's a massive 8 mana enchantment, but it gives creatures you control Myriad, meaning it creates a copy of them whenever you attack, tapped and attacking each other opponent. So if you've got a creature with an enters the battlefield effect, attacking an opponent, you now get 2 more copies of it, and 2 more copies twice of each of their enters the battlefield abilities. If we're looking at creatures with enter the battlefield effects, I think that it's a shoe-in, but keep in mind that it is the absolute top end of our curve. Angel of the Ruins, Legion Loyalty, that's the highest that we want to go from a mana value standpoint in this deck. But yes, it is a great way to double up on synergies. Okay, let's take a look at some of the other things that have enter the battlefield abilities. Here's a great one. Archaeomancer's Map. So Archaeomancer's Map, I think this is one of the most played new white cards as well. But it's an artifact that tutors up 2 planes to your hand when it enters the battlefield. Even if we don't have Elesh Norn out, it tutors up 2 planes to our hand, and then also, if an opponent has more lands than us, whenever they play a land, we get to put a land from our hand into play. Right? Incredible. It gets us towards casting Elesh Norn or Legion Loyalty or Angel of the Ruins that much faster. But the fact that with Elesh Norn out late in the game, we can now pull 4 planes out of our deck. 4 planes. That means it's 4 planes that we aren't drawing. Again, great. And, importantly, I don't know if you saw the mana value on it, but it's 3 mana. Again, a sweet spot for pulling things out of the graveyard in white. Right? Real good. Someone mentioned mono white Enchantress. Yeah. Let's take a look at Skybind here. But Skybind is Constellation. Whenever Skybind or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, exile target non-enchantment permanent. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So it's a delayed blink, or a flicker, as we'd call it. But it would trigger twice whenever we play an enchantment. Yes, Muffins. The second trigger, whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that is an enters the battlefield effect of a permanent you control triggering. If they control more lands than you, you would get to put 2 lands into play. But if you're putting 2 lands into play, very quickly, they aren't going to have more lands than you. So it's a great catch-up mechanic, which is one of White's strong suits. But if you've got Norn out and Archaeomancer's map, chances are you're probably the one in the lead to begin with. Okay, so Skybind is interesting. Skybind is very interesting because the thing with potentially going White Enchantress here is that the White enchantments themselves don't necessarily have a lot of ETB triggers. But there are a lot of enchantments that trigger off of, or a lot of permanents that trigger off of enchantments entering the battlefield. So you need to strike a balance between things that care about enchantments entering the battlefield and actual enchantments entering the battlefield. Because sometimes they're not one and the same. Sometimes it's not an enchantment caring about enchantments entering the battlefield. Sometimes it's a permanent without an enters the battlefield effect caring about enchantments entering the battlefield. We can do a quick look for Constellation here. Let's advanced search. Constellation. Now, let's go Constellation. No, not Condolation. Let's see. Constellation. So there are a total of 6 white permanents with Constellation. We've got Archon of Sun's Grace. Whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, you create a Pegasus token with flying. So this would be, well, with lifelink and flying in this case. But you create 2 whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield. Captivating Unicorn, tap 2 creatures. Favored of Iroas, give it double strike twice. That really doesn't do much. Harvest Guard Eyelids. Eyelids? Yeah. Azelids? Alcedes? Whatever. Whenever it or another enchantment enters the battlefield under your control, prevent all combat damage. Not much use in doubling that up. Pious Wayfarer. Target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn twice. And then Skybind, as we saw. So we could create a white Enchantress deck around Elesh Norn doubling up on our Enchantress effects, but there's just not a lot of them. We could put in the actual Enchantresses, Mesa Enchantress, for instance, but as long as they're ETB and not on cast, because I believe even Mesa Enchantress is a cast effect, not an ETB effect. Yeah, Mesa Enchantress is a cast effect. Whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you may draw a card. So it's a possibility. I just don't think that the pieces are there, personally, to do an Enchantress deck around Elesh Norn. I'd focus on creatures, artifacts, and enchantments with these removal abilities. I think that those are some of our best bets, personally. Right, we can do a lot with that. Hell, we could include Arkham's Astrolabe and make our plains snow-covered plains, and that way we can draw 2 cards for 1 mana. I wouldn't waste a slot in the deck for that, but we could do it. And there are some effects that, while we could include them, there's no point in doubling up on them. So things like, when something enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. You can't become the Monarch twice. And so not exactly an ability that you want to double up on. Right? There's stuff that can create tokens on ETB. But is it really impactful to make 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens? No, it's not. I think Soul Sister effects, like on Auriok Champion, Soul Warden, Soul's Attendant, are interesting. You can gain a lot of life this way because it does count what enters the battlefield under your opponent's control and doubles that up too. So gaining 2 life per Soul Sister for creature entering the battlefield, I think is decent. But you really want to be building around that because these aren't creatures that have their own enters the battlefield effects. And we've already dedicated a good quarter of the deck to our own enters the battlefield effects. Does it matter? It might. Is it good? Yeah, it's probably still good. But I think things like Banisher Priest, Banishing Light, these permanents that exile permanents on ETB are really good. So when Banishing Light enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until Banishing Light leaves the battlefield. Great. That's 2 permanents for 3 mana. That's above rate. Granted, all of these enchantments that do it are sorcery speed. Say for something like Banishment, which does have flash. But, again, these are all options when building that you can include. Banishment here is a great way to do things like exile all tokens that opponent controls. This is 4 mana flash. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls and all other non-land permanents your opponents control with the same name as that permanent until banishment leaves the battlefield. So if your opponent has a bunch of those cat tokens from Felidar Retreat that we included in this deck, this hits all of them at once. And you get to do it twice. So if there are 2 different kinds of tokens out there, it's great. Right? It's good. It's a good option. Honestly, I'd probably build around that. If we're looking at enchantments with enter the battlefield effects for that potential mono-white Enchantress build, that'd be where I'm looking at. Right? Interesting one here, Bishop of Binding. 4 mana for a 1/1. When it enters the battlefield, exile target creature an opponent controls until Bishop of Binding leaves the battlefield. When it attacks, target vampire gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the power of the exiled card. If you've got 2 cards exiled, I think you get both of those. I think you get X twice. Or X and then Y, where X and Y are the powers of the exiled creatures. I don't think you have to choose. Interesting. But some cool situations that you can create. Right? Here's Boonweaver Giant. Again, if you wanted to go the Enchantress route, Boonweaver Giant, 7 mana, but you tutor your graveyard, hand, and library for an aura card and attach it to Boonweaver Giant. You get to do this twice. So you could get a Gift of Immortality and Double Strike. Put it on there. See, I would 100% include the new fetches from, or the pseudo fetches here from New Capenna, because they enter the battlefield with a trigger. Is it? No, it's when you sacrifice it. Ooh, okay. So you wouldn't double up on that. Okay, so maybe not worth including. Ooh, we discover together, friends. It's a sacrifice trigger. It's not an enters the battlefield trigger. The enters the battlefield trigger is the sacrifice, and it's when you sacrifice it. Ooh, they thought ahead. Very interesting. Very interesting. Now, a card that I've been including in a lot of decks is Canoptic's Scarab Swarm from Warhammer 40k. A 4 mana flying artifact creature, insect, but when it enters the battlefield, exile target player's graveyard. For each artifact or land card exiled, you create a 1/1 flying artifact insect token. You get to do this to 2 graveyards on ETB. That's a lot of potential tokens you're creating. And if all of those tokens are generating an enters the battlefield effect, an enters the battlefield trigger, like on Soul Sisters, it's a lot of life that you can gain for 4 mana. I like that a lot. Canoptic Scarab Swarm. Quickly becoming one of my favorite cards. My favorite artifact of the year. Was definitely my favorite from the Warhammer 40k set. You were looking at the enchantments with ETBs, and there's not much there, even when combined with Blinking Stuff and Skybind. Yeah, it's unfortunate. The drawing cards when enchantments enter the battlefield is largely a green effect rather than a white effect. White cares more about cast triggers when it comes to Enchantress than it does ETB effects. And unfortunately, that's not where we want to be with Elesh Norn. Here's Cavalier of Dawn. When it enters the battlefield, we get to Generous Gift a permanent, or in this case, it would be 2 with Elesh Norn out. Then it's got that Dies trigger to return an artifact or enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand, potentially rebuying another enters the battlefield effect. I like that a lot. Caviar of Dawn. Cavalier of Dawn. Let's not be cavalier about this. Rumorgatherer, get a second resolution off of 1 creature. Yes, so that's an interesting one. So Rumorgatherer says Alliance, which is enters the battlefield, but whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry 1. If this is the second time this ability has resolved this turn, draw a card instead. So when 1 creature enters the battlefield under your control, you would get 2 triggers off of this. The first one would be a scry. The second one would be a draw card. Then if you've got a second creature that enters the battlefield, you would scry twice. So you would get the first and second trigger resolving off of 1 creature entering the battlefield. So rather than needing 2 creatures entering the battlefield to draw a card, you would only need 1. So keep in mind that if this is the second time the ability has resolved this turn. So it just cares about it clearing off of the stack, is what resolution means. So interesting. I'd still include it. It's great. All right, so there's a lot we can do as well. Here's Charming Prince. Here's another flicker effect, but with a couple of good enters the battlefield effects on it too, whether it be scrying 2, gaining 3 life. You would get to choose that on ETB. So you get double that, which, I mean, is useful. And it falls under that 3 mana to be pulled back too. Handy. Definitely. And there's a lot of really cool effects that we could be including in here. But there's also some non-bows to be aware of. Very interesting. Very interesting. I think that's a tweet waiting to happen. Let's see. Contagion Clasp and Contagion Engine. Contagion Engine in particular, putting -1/-1 counter on each creature target player controls. You can choose 2 different players on ETB, or you can choose the same player twice and put 2 -1/-1 counters on each creature they control. The Proliferate doesn't do a lot for us here, since we don't have a lot of +1/+1 counters outside of Felidar Retreat, but it's interesting nonetheless. Something you absolutely could do. Right? Oh, okay. Daring Archaeologist. Return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Okay, a way to rebuy stuff. It's 4 mana for a 3/3 and doesn't do much else otherwise. Gets a little bit bigger when you cast historic spells, but for 4 mana, I think we need a lot of synergy to put graveyards in artifacts in the graveyard to be pulling them out that much. Hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting things that we can do with this. And I'm mulling it over. How straightforward would a deck be like this? Do we include the Soul Sisters in it too? I think at this point, yes. I mean, Soul Warden, Soul's Attendant. We would want Oriok Champion. And we would want something like Suture Priest too. Because Suture Priest doubles up when creatures enter the battlefield under your opponent's control because you control this trigger. So it would be whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you can have that player lose 2 life. Thanks, Arctic. I appreciate you. Right. So, interesting. We would gain more life when creatures enter under our control. Our opponents would lose more life when creatures enter under theirs. Never underestimate doubling from 1 to 2. Okay? A lot of people see, hey, one life, losing 1 life isn't bad. When now they're losing 2 life every time that happens, that snowballs very, very quickly. At the outset, I mentioned Reckless Fireweaver, right? Nobody really cares if they're losing 1 life a turn to a Reckless Fireweaver. But when you start losing 2, 3, 4 life a turn to effects like that, it really starts making a difference. I've noticed, and here's something interesting, I've noticed that the tipping point for players to care about the amount of life they're losing or the amount of damage that's being done to them is 3 and 4. If you deal 1 or 2 damage to somebody, they're not likely to care very much. But if you start dealing 3 damage to somebody or 4 damage to somebody, they start sitting up and taking notice. So keep that in mind. Dealing 1 or 2 damage, great. You push that to 3 or 4, now you're starting to be a threat. Don't even get me started on 5 or 6 damage. That's an ouchie. And nobody's going to like that. But again, 3 or 4, that's going to start hurting. That's really going to smart. All right. I think we've got a great start to a deck so far. I think we can do some really cool stuff. Here's one that I've always been looking for a home for. Evangel of Heliod. 6 mana for a 1/3, objectively the best creature size. But you create a number of 1/1 white soldier creature tokens equal to your devotion to white. And you would do that twice. And I believe there's 2 effects like this as well. But it's a great way to go wide with an army. You can curve from Elesh Norn into Evangel of Heliod and start, even with just those 2 on the battlefield, start making 6 tokens right away. That's great. I think that's great value. Great value, great success. Walmart brand value. That's white for you. White's brand of value is Walmart brand. All right. Yeah. So we don't have a ton of cards filled out in the deck. We're at 27 right now. But keep in mind with nuts and bolts, like mana rocks and some more card draw pieces or card selection pieces, and all of the lands that we're adding, let's say that we're adding 38 planes. Right? Add more. We'll go 37. Right? Yeah, we've got room for, 35 more cards? No? 25 more cards? 35 more cards. 35 more cards. Right? And if 20 of that is going to be our targeted removal and our board wipe, it's great. Cipriano, thank you for the first time chat. But yes, we can look at Chain to the Rocks And there's another one as well. I think that I was looking at it back here. Yes, Chain to the Rocks and the new Chains of Custody. Oh no, Chains of Custody is the aura. Chain to the Rocks and On Thin Ice. Those are the two. Yeah. But Chain to the Rocks requires a mountain. Right. On Thin Ice requires just a snow-covered land, I believe. On Thin Ice. Yeah, enchant snow land you control. Exile target creature an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So potentially, if we do include snow-covered plains, that's 1 mana to exile 2 creatures. It's a good rate. We've included permanents in here that are 3 mana to exile 2 creatures. That might be a good argument for including snow-covered lands in the deck. I really think the way to build this is to be creature heavy, to be blink heavy, and the deck will do things even with Elesh Norn stuck in the command zone. This is a deck that's just going to work, but it's going to work that much better with Elesh Norn out. I think shutting off your opponent's ETB effects is a big one. I like this deck. I think that it's sleek, it's smooth, except I don't like that it's anti-synergistic with White's new draw effects. So keep that in mind. Heliod, God of the Sun, Staxy Constellation deck. Yeah, Cipriano, we were talking about a potential Enchantress deck. And really, there's not a lot of effects in mono white that care about enchantments entering the battlefield under your control. A lot of them care about cast and cast triggers rather than enters the battlefield effects. So I don't know if I do Enchantress or Constellation, but the option is there. Absolutely. I'd love to see your build if you're building it that way, for sure. And for everybody out there on YouTube, because I am going to be uploading this to YouTube, let me know how you would build the new Elesh Norn 2. Make sure to drop your deck lists in the description, and I'll be sure to take a look at them too. I think there's a lot of ways that we could be building this. I think that we're going to see a lot of new effects coming up in All Will Be One that are really going to help push this a little bit further. Okay? And for all of you that came out to hang out, thank you all very much. This full deck will be up later this week along with this video on YouTube, so be sure to check that out. If you are not subscribed to my YouTube channel, check out that link in chat right now. Hit the like, hit the subscribe. I am on my way to 15,000 subscribers, ideally by the end of the year. So if you are not a subscriber to the channel, head on over and do that right now. Okay. Once again, thank you to all of my amazing sponsors without whom this couldn't be possible. From Harry Tarantula, my fantastic affiliate. If you're looking to pick up any singles or pre-order anything from Phyrexia, All Will Be One, like the new Elesh Norn here, use my promo code CMDR5 for 5% off your first order, or use CMDR Mechanic just to help support the channel. And of course, we want to thank Moxfield, whom we've been building in all night long and who is the best deck building platform in the world. Head on over and check out my profile where you can check out all of my cool brews, even ones that haven't been released yet, and some updates to old ones. I know a lot of people have been asking for updated links to old decks. That's in process right now. So you can check out some of the ones you might have missed if you're a new subscriber. Thank you again, everybody, for hanging out. This is amazing. You are all beautiful. I hope you stay sexy. Have a fantastic week, and happy holidays to everyone.